There's a particular kind of book that gets handed to you before you're ready for it, usually by a teacher who already knows exactly what it's going to do to you. For a lot of kids, that book was The Outsiders, a slim paperback about greasers and socks in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that somehow ended up being the first real novel an entire generation of reluctant readers ever finished. In 1983, Francis Ford Coppola turned that paperback into a film, and in doing so assembled maybe the most absurdly stacked young cast in Hollywood history almost by accident. Before we get into it, stick around for the very end, because the most famous line in the entire movie wasn't actually written by the poet everyone credits it to. If you're new here, hit subscribe, and let's head down to Tulsa. Every copy of The Outsiders has always credited S.E. Hinton on the cover. Not Susan Eloise, just two flat initials, with any hint of gender quietly removed. That wasn't an accident, and it wasn't really her idea either. It came from her publisher, Viking Press. In 1967, the people deciding which books were worth taking seriously were almost entirely men, and a violent, unsentimental gang novel written by a teenage girl wasn't going to get a fair read if her first name was sitting right there on the jacket. So the initials went up, and Hinton effectively disappeared behind them. She'd started writing the book at 15, still a student at Will Rogers High School in Tulsa, and did most of the actual work at 16. The whole thing was sparked by something that happened to a friend of hers, who got jumped on the walk home, simply for looking like a greaser. Furious, Hinton went home and wrote the scene that eventually became the book's opening. A year and a half of revisions later, Viking agreed to publish it, and the contract arrived the same week she graduated high school. She wasn't legally an adult yet, so her mother had to co-sign it for her. Hinton later described the fiction being marketed to teenage girls at the time as tidy, polite stories where basically nothing happened. She put it more bluntly than that, but the point stands. The Outsiders was her answer to all of it. Ironically, in the same year she wrote a novel that would eventually sell more than 14 million copies. She got a poor grade in her creative writing class, mostly because she'd stopped caring about any assignment that wasn't the book. Hinton's asking price for the film rights was a modest $5,000. What she actually received up front was a tenth of that, $500, from a studio that was in genuinely rough shape. That studio was Coppola's own Zoetrope, which had just been gutted by the failure of One from the Heart, his 1982 musical that cost roughly $26 million to make and brought in only a small fraction of that at the box office. Coppola had bet heavily on that film and lost badly, which meant the same director, who had a shelf full of Academy Awards, was, at that exact moment, struggling to scrape together a five-figure rights fee. None of Coppola's prestige swayed Hinton much. She wasn't especially moved by The Godfather. What actually won her over was The Black Stallion, a 1979 film Coppola had produced, which she loved specifically because it treated its source material with real respect. She owned horses herself, had seen the film, and decided that was reason enough to trust him with her book. To seal the deal, Coppola gave her a small cameo as a hospital nurse, and she ended up hanging around the set almost daily throughout the shoot, feeding notes and context to a cast of young actors who were, in several cases, younger than the novel they were adapting. The film exists, in large part, because of a librarian named Joe Ellen Masakian and a stack of student signatures. In 1980, Masakian worked at Lone Star Elementary School in Fresno, California, and had a familiar problem on her hands. The boys in her school simply didn't read. One book kept breaking that pattern, though. Kids who never willingly touched a novel were fighting over the school's single copy of The Outsiders. So Masakian decided to try getting it turned into a movie. Her students put together a petition, 15 pages long, filled with names in every color of ink imaginable. She picked Coppola as the target and mailed the petition along with a copy of the novel to a New York business address her local library had tracked down. As it turned out, she got lucky in a way she couldn't have planned for. The office she'd mailed it to was one Coppola barely used, meaning her envelope landed directly in front of him instead of disappearing into a mountain of unread fan mail. A few months later, a reply came back to the school. Filming began almost exactly 2 years after Masakian dropped that envelope in the mail, and Coppola stayed in contact with the students throughout production, taking their feedback seriously. Before the film's wide release, The cast flew out to Fresno to screen it for the very kids who had petitioned for it. The finished movie even carries an on-screen dedication to the librarian and students of Lone Star School, the people who first asked for it to exist in the first place. The song playing over the opening credits, Stay Gold, wasn't some inexpensive stock track thrown in to save money. Stevie Wonder wrote and performed it himself, with music composed by Carmine Coppola, the director's own father, who had already scored the Godfather films and Apocalypse Now. Think about that pairing for a second. This was a movie that couldn't fully cover the licensing fee for the novel it was based on, and it opens with a Motown legend and an Oscar-winning composer sharing a single credit. Coppola was assembling a roughly $10 million production about kids who had almost nothing. Cast members were reportedly put up in modest housing, and every dollar was stretched to make a point about the story's own poverty. And the very first thing audiences heard was Stevie Wonder singing a ballad written specifically for a story about broke teenagers in Tulsa. He didn't phone it in, either. The song was built entirely around the film's central idea, that good things never stick around as long as you want them to. Picture one room containing Tom Cruise, Rob Lowe, Patrick Swayze, Emilio Estevez, Ralph Macchio, Matt Dillon, and C. Thomas Howell, all reading for the same small set of parts while the others sat a few feet away and watched. That was, more or less, how Coppola ran his auditions. Less a traditional casting call and more an acting workshop, where he'd rotate dozens of young actors through every role until an ensemble finally clicked into place. It was intentional and it was brutal. Anthony Michael Hall came through that process and didn't make the cut, while C. Thomas Howell landed the lead role of Ponyboy at just 15 years old. Hall, of course, went on to build an entirely different career soon after with John Hughes. Rob Lowe later recalled one of the strangest parts of the whole process. Even while these guys were competing directly against each other for the same roles, they were helping each other with hair and makeup between takes. He described the group as deadly serious and fiercely competitive, and in the same breath called them his closest friends from that era. The more remarkable part isn't who got cast, it's who didn't. Sean Penn read for a role. So did Mickey Rourke, Robert Downey Jr., Timothy Hutton, Dennis Quaid, and even Scott Baio. None of them made the final cut, and every one of them went on to have a substantial career anyway. Coppola had assembled a room so deep with future talent that getting rejected from it still put you on a fast track to stardom. Coppola didn't want the actors playing greasers and the actors playing socks getting too comfortable with each other off camera. So he built the story's class divide directly into their real lives on set. The actors playing socks got the nicer hotel rooms, bigger per diems, and cleaner scripts. The actors playing greasers got the cheaper rooms, smaller stipends, and beaten-up paperback scripts to match their characters. He pushed the idea even further by sending the greaser actors to spend a night in the actual homes of working-class families in Tulsa. That's reportedly how Rob Lowe and Tom Cruise ended up sleeping on a couch in an Oklahoma basement, near someone's furnace, which is a striking detail considering that only weeks earlier, Cruise had reportedly been upset about merely sharing a New York hotel room with Lowe, and had insisted on his own room. When Coppola later told him to go sleep on a stranger's couch for the sake of the film, Cruise apparently did it without complaint. By the time cameras rolled, the tension between the two groups didn't need to be acted. It had already been lived in. On paper, Steve Randall is arguably the least essential greaser in the entire story. He's Soda Pop's best friend. He doesn't die, and he barely has an arc of his own. And yet Tom Cruise treated the part like a lead role in an entirely different movie. It started with his teeth. Cruise had a chipped front tooth that had been capped, and before filming began, he reportedly had the cap removed specifically so Steve would look rougher on camera. Then, during the notoriously chaotic week-long shoot of the Rumble scene, a stretch that also left Emilio Estevez with a split lip and C. Thomas Howell with a black eye, Cruise took a real punch to the jaw and needed emergency dental work the next morning. The Tulsa dentist who treated him reportedly kept a photo of the future star on the wall for years afterward. Off camera, Cruise and Rob Lowe would apparently box in the hotel hallways for fun, and Lowe has said Cruise once landed a punch solid enough that he still remembers it. And then there's the backflip. Cruise was reportedly the only cast member who could actually do one, which explains why Steve unexpectedly does a clean backflip while running out of a house partway through the film. Nobody reacts to it. Nothing in the scene calls for it. Coppola simply saw it happen, decided it worked, and left it in the final cut of a movie that's otherwise about grief and lost innocence. The fire in the film's church sequence was a real fire, and at one point it got more real than anyone had planned for, chasing realism the way he often did. Coppola reportedly kept calling for more flame during the shoot, and the small controlled blaze took the note a little too seriously, briefly spiraling out of control. What ultimately helped bring it back under control wasn't the crew. It was a sudden downpour that rolled in and helped douse it. The church wasn't just a backdrop either. It's the moment the entire story pivots, Johnny and Ponyboy running back into the flames to pull children to safety. The act that briefly makes them heroes, right before everything else in the story falls apart. Coppola's insistence on getting the fire right wasn't recklessness for its own sake. He was chasing the single scene the whole narrative hinges on, and he wanted the danger on screen to feel completely genuine. For a few minutes during that shoot, it apparently was. The now famous promotional image, 7 greasers glaring into the camera, the shot that's been on merchandise for 4 decades, actually came out of a photo session that was supposed to look far more serious and threatening. According to cast accounts, Leif Garrett wandered toward the craft services table during a break, and Ralph Macchio cracked a joke about the food being reserved for the talent. The whole group burst out laughing. The photographer kept the camera rolling, and that laugh became the poster everyone knows today. The timing makes the story even better. In 1982, Leif Garrett may well have been the most recognizable face in that entire cast. He'd already been a teen idol since the mid-1970s, with a music career and a string of film and TV credits well before most of his castmates had booked their first real job. By the time the poster was shot, Garrett was 20 and playing a supporting antagonist, surrounded by 7 young actors who were about to spend the next decade becoming some of the biggest names in Hollywood. Every person laughing in that frame went on to more fame than Garrett would ever quite recapture, and none of them had any idea at the time that the photo would end up being the one everyone remembers. During the drive-in scene, Matt Dillon tips backward out of his chair, and it wasn't written that way. He genuinely lost his balance in the moment, and Coppola simply kept the cameras rolling. For a split second, a 15-year-old C. Thomas Howell glances directly into the camera, apparently checking whether Coppola was about to call cut. He didn't, so the shot stayed in the final film. That instinctive glance is really the whole story. Coppola had spent weeks encouraging the young cast to stop performing and just exist together like real teenagers, and when Dillon fell, Howell didn't stay in character. He did exactly what an actual 15-year-old would do, and look for the nearest adult in charge. Coppola left the moment untouched because it doesn't land as a well-acted beat. It lands because, for one unplanned second, nobody in frame was acting at all. The rumble scene is mostly remembered as 2 minutes of mud, rain, and chaos, but the real trivia is hiding in the background. One of the extras playing a SOC was a young musician credited as Flea, his very first film role, and it happened more than a year before the Red Hot Chili Peppers even released a debut album, meaning his acting career technically predates his music career. A few bodies over is a 17-year-old Cam Neely, at the time chasing a spot in the NHL. He'd eventually become a Boston Bruins legend and a Hockey Hall of Fame inductee. And then there's Nicolas Cage, born Nicholas Kim Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola's own nephew, who auditioned seriously for the role of Dallas Winston, reportedly locking himself away to study photos of Charles Bronson to nail the attitude, and still lost the part to Matt Dillon. He dropped the Coppola surname not long afterward, determined to build a career that wouldn't be tied to his uncle's name. He's rumored to appear briefly and uncredited somewhere in the rumble scene, though that detail is still debated by fans to this day. The background cast doesn't stop there. Melanie Griffith reportedly appears as a background to see Heather Langenkamp, filmed a small cameo as Steve's girlfriend a year before A Nightmare on Elm Street made her a household name, though her scenes were ultimately cut before release. And the young girl who asks Dallas for spare change, credited only as Domino, is Sofia Coppola, who would go on to win an Academy Award decades later for Lost in Translation. It's a strange thought. One of the most talent-dense backgrounds in 1980 cinema is quietly buried inside a muddy gang fight in Tulsa. Midway through the shoot, Coppola reportedly asked Hinton if she had another book he could adapt next. She pointed him toward Rumblefish, a stranger and more difficult novel that she was so protective of that she wouldn't even hand him a copy. He ended up buying one himself. Within days, he came back completely hooked on the idea. So every Sunday, the cast and crew's one scheduled day off from The Outsiders, Coppola and Hinton sat down together and worked on the Rumblefish screenplay. By the time The Outsiders wrapped, they had a finished draft, and that same summer, still in Tulsa, still using much of the same crew and several of the same actors, Coppola began shooting it. Rumblefish ultimately made only a fraction of its production budget back at the box office, which says a lot about how much financial pressure Coppola was carrying that entire year. He spent his single day of rest working on the very movie that would go on to lose money, while the one that would eventually be considered a classic was already consuming the rest of his week. The Curtis family home in the film wasn't a set built for the production. It was a real house at 731 North St. Louis Avenue in Tulsa. Once filming wrapped, the house simply sat there for the next couple of decades, slowly falling apart until it was eventually facing demolition. In 2009, Danny Boy O'Connor, best known as a member of the hip-hop group House of Pain, had a short layover in Tulsa while on tour. He'd loved The Outsiders since he was a teenager, so he had a cab driver take him around the old filming locations, found the deteriorating house, and took a photo that ended up going viral online.